It seemed like the perfect job at first. A chance to earn a paycheck with minimal work. A night watcher at a ghost town? Sure, the idea sounded strange, but I wasn't one to shy away from odd opportunities, especially when money was tight. The ad in the paper promised good pay for little more than sitting around at night, ensuring no one trespassed on the property. Little did I know, this would be the job I'd never be able to forget. The town of Hollow Creek sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by barren land and the kind of silence you only find in places left behind. It was one of those forgotten towns, the kind you see in horror movies or hear about in ghost stories, only this one wasn't fictional. People had once lived there, worked there, and now, nothing. Hollow Creek was a ghost town, quite literally, with only its crumbling buildings, dusty streets, and an unsettling emptiness to remind anyone of its past. The ad didn't mention much more than the job description: night watchman needed for Hollow Creek, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. every night. Rules to follow. Pay is decent. I wasn't expecting much beyond that. It didn't seem like a big deal. The town had been abandoned for decades, or so I thought. Most of the structures were dilapidated, with boards covering windows and doors, and rust had long taken over the street signs. But the job? It seemed easy enough. The hours were right, and the rules sounded simple. When I arrived, the town was even quieter than I imagined. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty streets. The road was a dirt path, winding through what used to be a main street. The only sound that broke the silence was the occasional rustle of wind through the skeletal remains of buildings. I met the town's caretaker, a man named Roy. He was older than I expected, his face weathered and worn, his eyes a dull gray. Roy had lived there for as long as I could tell. He was the one who handed me the job, and he seemed eager to explain everything. "You'll be here for the night shifts, obviously," Roy said, his voice raspy. "But I need to stress something. The rules. You have to follow them." He handed me a small, crumpled sheet of paper. The writing was faded, and some of the ink had smudged, but it was still legible. There were only 5 rules, but each one felt heavy, like it carried more weight than it should. Rule number 1. Roy started, pointing to the first line. "Stay inside the town limits. Don't venture into the woods. You'll hear things, but don't go looking for them." I nodded, unsure what he meant, but assuming it was some local superstition or perhaps a reminder to stay safe. The second rule was similar. Rule 2. Don't approach the old mine. The entrance is sealed for a reason. Trust me on that. The old mine? I didn't see it on my walk around, but it was probably at the edge of town, hidden behind some of the broken-down shacks. I wasn't sure why anyone would need to go near it, but I jotted it down in my mind. Rule 3. Lock all doors and windows at midnight. Don't leave anything open. It's safer that way. At this point, I raised an eyebrow. The town was abandoned. There were no people here, just me and Roy, and I was about to work the graveyard shift in an empty ghost town. But I kept listening. Rule 4. If you hear knocking on your door, do not answer it. No matter who it is, don't open the door. I stared at him. "Knocking? But there's no one here. Are you—" Roy held up a hand, cutting me off. "You'll understand. Just follow the rules." The last rule was the most unsettling. Rule 5. When your shift is over, leave. Don't wait for sunrise. Get out of town before 6 a.m. It's not safe after that. I didn't know what Roy meant, but I could see the seriousness in his eyes. He wasn't joking. After he finished explaining, Roy gave me a key to the small shack I'd be staying in. It wasn't much, just a room with a cot, a small heater, and a lantern. "Get some rest, son," he said, his voice carrying an odd heaviness. "You'll need it." I spent my first few hours there, walking the streets of Hollow Creek, taking in the odd stillness. The old storefronts and homes were all abandoned, with nothing but the remnants of the past scattered across the streets. It was as if time had frozen the town in the moment it was left behind. As the clock ticked closer to 10 p.m., I found myself waiting at the small shack, wondering what the night had in store. I'd heard rumors of ghost towns like this one, stories of hauntings, lost souls, and unfinished business, but I never put stock in them. Now, as I sat in the darkening room, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. The wind picked up again, rattling the windows of my shack, and that's when I heard it. A low, distant sound, the soft thud of something heavy hitting the ground, far off in the distance. I leaned forward in my seat, staring into the dimming light of the lantern. I listened, straining to hear if it came again, but nothing followed. It was just the wind, I convinced myself, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something else, something waiting. Just as I stood up to investigate, the door to the shack rattled. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could react, I heard it. Faint, distant knocking. The knocking came again, a rhythmic sound that echoed through the small shack. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound reverberated against the walls. It wasn't just a knock, it was deliberate, as if someone was trying to get my attention. Someone, or something, was outside. I glanced toward the door. The rules rang in my head. If you hear knocking, do not answer it. No matter who it is, don't open the door. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I gripped the edge of the table. The knocking continued, soft but steady, growing louder as though whatever was out there was becoming more insistent. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The shack, which had seemed like a safe haven just moments ago, suddenly felt far too small. The shadows in the room grew longer, creeping along the walls like living things. I could hear the wind picking up outside, howling through the trees, but the knocking remained, the one sound that stood out in the night. I had no idea how long I stood there, just staring at the door, too afraid to approach. The knocking wasn't stopping. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. A raccoon or a stray dog, but no, it was too precise, too intentional. There was something else out there, and I didn't know if I was ready to face it. I glanced at the clock. 11:30 p.m. My shift had just begun, and already it felt like something was wrong, like I had stepped into a nightmare I couldn't escape. I remembered the last rule Roy had given me: leave before sunrise. I wasn't sure what would happen if I stayed, but I wasn't ready to test that just yet. The knocking persisted, louder now. It felt like it was right next to the door, as if whatever was out there had moved closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. My body moved on its own, my feet carrying me toward the door despite every nerve screaming at me to stay away. I reached for the handle, but the moment my hand touched it, the knocking stopped. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the knocking had been. It was too quiet. The wind had died down. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I stepped back slowly, glancing nervously around the room. Everything seemed so still, too still. I didn't want to be the fool who opened the door, but at the same time I couldn't just ignore what was happening. The strange stillness made me feel like I was missing something. something important. The first rule is broken. The door rattled again, this time louder than before, but the voice that followed made my blood run cold. "Help me." It was a soft, desperate voice, too quiet at first, then louder, more frantic. The voice sounded human, but there was something wrong with it. It echoed through the door like it was trapped in the walls, distorted and unnatural. I stepped back, my eyes wide with disbelief. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't help myself. I reached for the door again, the sound of the voice pulling me toward it like a magnet. I twisted the knob, and the door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan. My eyes went wide when I saw what was on the other side. Nothing. The porch outside was empty, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the broken wooden steps. The knocking had stopped, the voice had faded, but I was still standing there, staring into the emptiness. I stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat. The wind had died completely, and the world was as still as a tomb. There were no signs of life, no footprints, no movement. It was like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned around to go back inside, but just as I did, I heard it. A soft rustle, like something moving in the shadows behind me. I whipped around, flashlight in hand, but the beam only illuminated empty space. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. The town comes to life. I stepped back inside, the door slamming shut behind me with a force that rattled the old wooden frame. My heart was racing, my mind in overdrive as I tried to process what had just happened. Was it a prank? Some kind of sick joke? I had to be imagining things. It had to be the wind or an animal. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking, the voice, it was too real. I glanced toward the window, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure moving in the distance. Just a flash, a blur of movement at the far end of the town. My breath caught in my throat as I turned away quickly, not wanting to see any more. I didn't care what it was. I had to follow the rules. I had to stay inside. I glanced at the clock again, 12:15 a.m. The first hour had passed, but I had no idea how much longer I could stand this. The rules were meant to keep me safe, but now they felt like a trap. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I could feel it. The town wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting. It was alive in some way I didn't understand, and I was a part of it now. A faint sound reached my ears from outside the shack, a soft thud followed by another. I strained to listen, my heart pounding. It was coming from the town, from somewhere beyond my sight. The noise was getting closer, and I could hear something else too, a low, raspy breathing. It was like something was moving toward me, shuffling through the darkened streets of Hollow Creek. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, crunching through the gravel, heading straight toward the shack. The footsteps were getting closer, slow, deliberate, echoing against the silence that had settled over Hollow Creek. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened, my pulse hammering in my chest. I couldn't tell if the footsteps belonged to a person, an animal, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain. Whatever it wasn't friendly. I stood frozen in place, every nerve on edge. The knocking, the whispers, the footsteps, all of it was connected, and I was in the center of it, trapped. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the footsteps. They were coming from outside, somewhere near the edge of the shack. The ground was too quiet for me to hear if they were moving toward the door or circling the building. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. I glanced around nervously, but the shadows seemed to shift with the flickering light, as if the room itself were alive. I reached for the door handle, my fingers cold and stiff with fear. The footsteps paused. My hand froze, and I stood motionless, waiting for what would come next. The silence stretched, growing unbearable until, thud, thud, a heavy knock, deep and hollow, rapped against the side of the shack. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat as the sound reverberated through the walls. It was the same knock I had heard earlier, the one that had set my nerves on edge. But now, it was different, closer, louder, and far more insistent. I stumbled back from the door, my mind racing. The rules, Roy's rules. If you hear knocking, do not answer it. But how could I just ignore it? What if someone needed help? What if it was another person, lost in the town? Number I couldn't risk it. I had to follow the rules. My pulse raced as I turned away from the door, backing into the center of the room. The knocking came again, louder this time, closer, right at the window. I could almost feel the vibrations beneath my feet. My hands shook as I pressed my back against the wall, my mind screaming at me to do something, to find a way to escape, to leave this cursed place behind. But the town wasn't going to let me leave. I knew that now. The footsteps returned, this time on the other side of the shack. I heard the creaking of the floorboards, the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving inside. I wasn't sure how it was possible. There was no one else here. I had been the only one in this godforsaken place since I arrived. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling, weak, desperate. I was hoping against hope that this was just a bad dream. Maybe someone had wandered in by accident. Someone who hadn't heard the warnings. No answer. I glanced at the window, my flashlight beam trembling in the dark, but I saw nothing. No movement, no figures, no signs of life outside. The air grew colder again, that deep chill seeping into the walls like a living thing. I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to get out, but something held me in place. It was like the town was reaching out, pulling me back, trapping me in its grip. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, heavy and erratic. But the silence didn't bring comfort. It only made the tension worse. I felt like something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to slip up. The wind began to howl again, picking up speed, but it was different this time. The wind wasn't just rattling the windows, it was whispering, the sound growing louder, more insistent. The whispers, they were everywhere, from the wind, from the trees outside, from the cracks in the shack's walls. "Leave, leave, leave." The voices hissed in unison, the words like an echo in my mind. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't work. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they were inside my head, filling my thoughts, clouding my judgment. I staggered back toward the door, my hands shaking, my mind a storm of confusion. I didn't know if I could stand it much longer. I had to leave. I had to. "Don't go." The voice was soft but clear, right behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but no one was there. The shack was empty, the room cold and still. The wind had stopped. The whispers had stopped. And then the door rattled. I wasn't imagining it. The sound came again, louder this time. Someone, or something, was on the other side. I had to get out of here. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I was done. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I tried the handle, but the door didn't budge. It was locked. I twisted the knob again, panic rising in my chest, but it wouldn't open. The sound of the rattling grew louder, like a steady thumping, as if something was trying to break through. "Please, let me out," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. But then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The whispers faded into nothing. The wind died down. The world outside the shack fell into a suffocating silence. I let out a shaky breath, unsure of what had just happened. But one thing was clear. I was not alone in this place. Hollow Creek had its secrets, and I had just begun to uncover them. The silence was suffocating. I stood there, my hand still clutching the door handle, not sure if I wanted to turn it or if I should just wait for whatever this was to end. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt the walls pressing in on me. It was like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. And then the door rattled again. The noise was different this time. It was more like scratching, the kind of sound you hear when something claws at the wood, trying to break through. I stepped back, instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. Something was out there. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The knocking had stopped, replaced by the scratching, a low, persistent sound that seemed to reverberate through the shack. It was like the very walls of the building were alive, moving, breathing in the same oppressive air. The idea of staying inside, waiting, felt like a death sentence. But what about going outside? I had no idea what waited for me in the dark streets of Hollow Creek, and something told me that leaving the shack was just as dangerous. I took a slow, cautious step back toward the window, hoping to peer outside without drawing attention to myself. The moonlight barely illuminated the streets, but I could make out shapes, figures standing motionless at the far end of the street. I could see their eyes, empty, hollow, and they were looking directly at me. I stepped back quickly, my heart racing in my chest. I had to get out. I had to escape. I had to... A voice cut through my panic, so close I could feel the breath against my ear. "Leave, or they will come for you." The words came from nowhere, but it was unmistakable. The voice was low, guttural, almost mechanical. It was the same voice I had heard earlier when I first arrived in the town, but now it was clearer, sharper. I spun around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in this shack any longer, not with those figures outside watching me, not with whatever force was behind those whispers. I grabbed the key from my pocket, rushing to the door, but the moment I touched the handle, I stopped. My mind screamed for me to turn it, to escape, but something in my gut told me that opening that door was a mistake. I couldn't be sure what was out there, but I knew it wasn't safe. I stepped away from the door, staring at it, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. It was as if the town itself was a living entity, feeding on fear, waiting for something, or someone, to open the door and step into its embrace. Suddenly, the town seemed to come alive. I heard the faintest sound, almost imperceptible at first, like footsteps scraping along the dirt road outside. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone, something was moving closer. I couldn't take it anymore. The pressure was too much. I had to do something. The door rattled again, but this time it wasn't the sound of scratching or knocking. It was a soft, almost pleasant tap, like someone was knocking at the door in the most normal way. It was so out of place that it made my stomach churn. I moved toward the window again, my breath shallow as I tried to peer outside. The figures in the street were still standing there, their eyes fixed on me. But now, there was more movement. They were moving toward the shack. Slowly, methodically, they were coming. I turned, the door now standing in front of me like a barrier I couldn't cross. My fingers hovered over the handle, but I knew it wouldn't help. The town had me. It was pulling me in, feeding off my fear, and there was no escaping it. And then, just as I was about to lose all hope, I heard something else. A voice. But this time, it wasn't from outside. It was inside my head. "Don't go," it whispered, as soft as the wind, but unmistakable. I spun around again, but no one was there. The door behind me slammed open. The world around me tilted. I looked out into the street, but the figures were gone. The air was still. Too still. And in that silence, I realized what was happening. Hollow Creek wasn't just haunted by ghosts. The town itself was alive. It was feeding on me, on anyone who entered. And there was no escaping it. The door slammed open with such force that it shook the shack, sending a wave of terror coursing through my body. The wind howled outside, pushing against the walls like it was alive. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I turned to look back at the empty street, but the figures were gone. But the stillness outside wasn't comforting. It was worse. It felt like something was waiting. The air inside the shack was too thick now, suffocating, pressing down on me like the town was closing in around me. The wind seemed to speak through the cracks in the walls, the whispers louder now, the voices overlapping, like a crowd murmuring from all directions. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. I had to get out of Hollow Creek before the town swallowed me whole. I turned back to the door, but the moment I stepped toward it, something stopped me. A cold, icy sensation washed over my body, as though the very air in the shack had turned to ice. I froze, my legs stiff, my breath shallow as I tried to force myself to move. But I couldn't. It was as if the town had a hold on me, like it was pulling me back. The voices in my head grew louder, now more distinct. "You can't leave," they whispered in unison, a chorus of cold, hollow voices. I turned around, but there was no one in the room with me. The shack was empty, still, silent, yet the voices grew louder, like they were right next to me, suffocating me with their presence. "You belong to Hollow Creek," they hissed. "You always have." I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the realization. The town wasn't just haunted. It was feeding off me. It was alive in a way I couldn't understand, and it had been waiting for me. The knocking at the door, the whispering voices, the figures in the street. It had all been building to this moment. I had become part of Hollow Creek. I had been pulled into its curse and there was no way out. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The town had been abandoned for so long, forgotten by the world. But it wasn't empty. No, it had always been waiting for someone to enter, someone to feed on, someone to become part of it. And I had walked right into its trap. I had broken the rules, stepped outside the lines, and now I was a part of it, just like the others. I couldn't stay. The town had me. I had to get out. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, but the wood creaked and groaned, as if the shack itself was holding me inside. Panic surged through me as I turned, desperate to find another way out. The window. I could break the window, crawl through, but as I approached it, the glass warped, bending and twisting in the moonlight, like it was alive, pulsating with some unnatural force. I stepped back, my mind racing. I couldn't get out. The town wouldn't let me. I could hear the wind picking up again, the eerie howling sound, now accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, drawing closer. The whispers intensified, their voices growing sharper. "Come," they beckoned. "Come to the heart of the town." I turned toward the door again, trying to force myself to open it, but I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, a pressure that froze me in place. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and found myself face to face with a figure standing in the doorway. The figure from the street, the one that had been watching me. It stepped forward, its long, ragged coat billowing behind it, its face obscured by a tattered mask. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The figure stepped aside, revealing a faint light at the end of the hallway. I knew then. I knew where the town wanted me to go. I didn't want to follow. I didn't want to go down that hallway to step deeper into Hollow Creek's suffocating grip. But I was drawn forward, as if my body was no longer mine to control. The figure stood motionless, watching me, its empty eyes never leaving me. It didn't need to speak. Its presence was enough. And as I stepped forward, the walls around me seemed to shift, pulling me toward that light. I had no choice. The town had made sure of that. The light at the end of the hallway flickered, then flared up, illuminating a room I hadn't noticed before. The walls were lined with old, crumbling photographs, pictures of people long gone, faces blurred and faded with age. But in the center of the room was something else. A large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and broken. And I could see, reflected in the glass, a version of myself. Except it wasn't me. It was Hollow Creek. The figure's hand rested on my shoulder again, and I felt a cold rush through me. I could see my reflection, but it wasn't my face looking back at me. It was the faces of those who had come before me. The lost souls who had wandered into this town and never left. The ones the town had claimed. I tried to pull away, but it was too late. I was already part of it. The reflection smiled, and I did too.